So what can we do as individuals to promote constructive dialogue and discourse to work towards creating respectful, constructive solutions to meet the challenges we face?
Well, so I think it's in clubs like this, that bring people together for these kind of discussions where we can all make a difference. I think we all need a huge dose of empathy.
Welcome, everyone. Familiar faces, new faces. Nice to see so many of you here. Full house here. Welcome to the Commonwealth Club World Affairs program. My name is Raj Mathai. I'm the lead anchor at NBC Television here in the Bay Area. I'm your moderator for this event today. A special thanks, before we bring out General McMaster, a special thanks to the Travers Family Foundation for supporting today's Ethics and Accountability program. It is now my pleasure to honor the former National Security Advisor. H.R. McMaster served in the U.S. Army as an officer for 34 years. He retired as a lieutenant general in 2018. He was also, of course, the National Security Advisor for President Trump beginning in 2017. He served in that role for a little more than 1 year. He is currently the senior fellow at the Hoover Institute at Stanford University, also a fellow at the Freeman Spogli Institute, both at Stanford. In his new book, which is really fascinating to read, if you haven't already read it, please pick up a copy. It's here today as well. At War with Ourselves, My Tour of Duty in the Trump White House. General McMaster offers a frank assessment of the significant achievements and challenges, and that's key, the pros and the cons that he faced during his time as the National Security Advisor for President Trump in this country. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage General H.R. McMaster.
Right. Thanks so much. Thank you. Thanks.
Nice to have you here.
Hey, thanks to you, the Commonwealth Club, the Travers Family Foundation, and all of you who came. Thank you. Great to be with you.
Anything happening in the world of politics lately?
Too much, right? Too much.
That we should know about. Okay, before we get going, just tell me a day in the life right now. You're done with the book, so you can't use that as a crutch anymore.
Right.
Day in the life down at Stanford. What are you doing now?
Yeah. So I'm a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution. I love it, and because first of all, I decided to only teach at a university I could not have gotten into. That was my standard. And so I get to work with fantastic students and really just great colleagues, within the Hoover Institution, but across the faculty at Stanford. I'm learning every day. We have a really neat research team of graduates and undergraduates who work together to understand better the challenges and opportunities we're facing internationally. And hashtag predictable, for a washed up general. When I retired from the Army, I made a mission statement for myself to try to contribute to a more full and comprehensive understanding of the most significant challenges and opportunities we face internationally as a way to bring Americans together for meaningful, respectful discussions. So we have the kind of common understanding we need so we can work together and build a better future, So I don't know how well that's going, but and the respectful part, but we're working on it.
Well, I think I speak for everyone in this room, regardless of their political bent. We appreciate what you've done for the country and what you continue to do for this country. Thank you so much.
Well, thanks, Raj. Thank you.
And one more, and I know I have some space between you, so you won't come at me. Does anyone ever call you Herbert Raymond McMaster?
Of course, my mom named me HR because she was afraid my father's name was Herbert, that I'd be called Herbie. and of course, just knowing that's what my mom didn't want me to be called, that's what all my football and rugby teammates called me. Of course, all through high school and at West Point. But
and you're a hard-scrambled guy from the Philly area, right?
I am, absolutely.
Okay, I told you this, and I'm going to tell all of you this. This book usually would take me about a week to read. I got kids and the job. But it took me about 2.5 weeks to read because every chapter took me a day or two because I'm stopping down and referencing, going down these rabbit holes of what you're bringing up. Little things of why Air Force One doesn't have reclining seats in the galley area. I'm looking up Shakespeare, Macbeth, because you reference it. The meeting at NATO before Trump went in and you guys were all in the Beast, which is the limousine. So it's fascinating, the levels and nuances in this book. Well, why write this? Let's just start with that.
Well, first of all, I'm a historian, and so I felt a duty to share my perspective on what I think was a pivotal and very consequential year in recent American history. I want to kind of give readers a tour of what it's like to serve in a White House, what it was like to serve in the Trump administration, what it's like to be a national security advisor. Hey, what the heck does a national security advisor do? And I wanted to tell the story of how we encountered a lot of obstacles. Remember all the headlines, Raj, back in the day when I was there. Every other headline was chaos, this, chaos, that. But really the story is about how our team worked together to transcend that chaos and I think to put into place some pretty significant and important shifts in U.S. foreign policy. So, I hope that the tone of the book is not one of, gosh, how hard it was, but it's really that it was a privilege to serve even under what I think we all recognize are challenging conditions because we are at war with ourselves. We're at war with ourselves, I think, based on the kind of vitriolic nature of the partisan political discourse, which is bad for our psyches. We all know that, right? But it's also bad for governance. And so a lot of the book is about how, that polarization that we're seeing, these centripetal forces that are feeding each other and spinning us apart from each other, really impede a president's ability to get anything done, you know?
You said something in this, and I quote now from your book. I knew when I took the job that my shelf life would be limited. Reports that I had never really clicked with Trump were accurate. I did not need Trump as a friend, but I did need him to trust me. Those who wanted me out worked hard to erode that trust. That's a big nugget, a big paragraph that you write there.
Right. And what that alludes to is, the president and I have much different personalities, backgrounds, and everything else. But what is most important, I think, in government is trust. And I use an epigraph for the postscript of the book from George Shultz, who many of you know and loved here in this area, who served as a senior fellow at Hoover till the age of 100. It was still come in and was a huge part of the work that we did at the Hoover Institution. He just made this simple statement that I use as the epigraph of the postscript. When trust was in the room, good things happened. When trust was not in the room, good things did not happen. And so those who have an agenda in mind, those who don't want to give the elected president multiple options and best analysis so the president can determine his or her own agenda in an administration, those are people who try to instead manipulate decisions consistent with their own agendas. And those who had their own agendas in mind saw what we were doing, the National Security Council staff and those with whom we were working across the government to present multiple options to the president as a danger, right? As a danger to what they wanted to achieve. And then, of course, in the Trump administration, I think it's true in all administrations, but maybe a higher number of people in that Trump administration, what maybe his first of two administrations, we'll see. I think there are a lot of people who define themselves in the role of saving the country and the world from the president. And what I write about in the book is that those latter two groups of people, not only are they not serving the president well, but also I think what they're doing is undermining the Constitution because if sovereignty lies with the people, it's the president who got elected, right? Nobody elects national security advisors or cabinet officials. So that was an element of the tension that I encountered, where really what were the base motivations of those who were in the administration and how a different understanding of our roles created a lot of that tension.
The Shakespearean reference to Macbeth, the three wicked sisters, who are they here?
I do talk.
It's in the book.
I do use Shakespearean analogies because I do think Shakespeare wrote quite clearly about power and power games, right? And so the weird sisters are of course creating toil and trouble. By disinformation, by creating innuendo, by various subtle forms of slander and so forth, and that's what some people within the administration. I mean, the classic example, Steve Bannon, were engaged in that kind of activity which is regrettable because it breaks up teamwork, but it just distracts from the important work that the country has to do, And I describe in the book how in the summer of 2017, I was on the receiving end of a massive social media attack campaign. At the time, I think the Atlantic Council's Digital Forensic Laboratory said it was the largest social media campaign against any individual that they had witnessed up to that point. And that was initiated in sort of I guess you would call it the alt-right. These terms sometimes aren't very useful. pseudo media and social media ecosystem. And then the Russians thought, hey, this is a great opportunity to get rid of that guy who's telling President Trump to be tough on Vladimir Putin and Russia, and they jumped in on it. So a lot of the traffic that was generated in the United States was then magnified by the Russian bots and trolls, the so-called Internet Research Agency, which is really a front organization for Russian intelligence agencies.
Were you feared for your life at all in terms of your safety or your family? And to ask you that question means a lot because you've been on the front lines.
Yeah, I've realized in my life that fear is not a useful emotion in any situation like that. And I've been in actual combat. Like I wasn't fearful. I think you learn in the military that you focus on the mission and you focus on your team and your soldiers, your fellow servicemen and women. And as a leader, I think that responsibility insulates you from fear, insulates you really from the kind of negative anxiety or angst that you might expect to come along with those kind of attacks. But then, I realized, that it was affecting my family, and it was also affecting, members of our team who came under concerted attack as well by these people. So what I resolved to do was to transcend it, to not play these games. I mentioned in the book how very early on in my time as National Security Advisor, I talked to every living National Security Advisor to hear, his or her advice about the job, and so I got to know Henry Kissinger pretty well over that period of time, who was a great source of support. He also had a great sense of humor, and when I started writing this book, I did a Zoom with him, and I said, hey, what's your advice? He goes, oh, don't do what I did. Don't try to write everything, in his book, the White House years. But then I told him, I said, Henry, looking back on this at the time when you and I were talking, I had a fundamental choice to make between either getting mired in these games, these power politics games, or trying to transcend it. And I said, I knew I'd be terrible at fighting these games, and plus, what we really need to do is focus on the mission. So my answer was always like more transparency, and just try even harder to foster a collaborative relationship. And after I told him that, he said, you made the right choice. They would have eaten you alive.
Those are some interesting conversations. Looking back, you were in a line, some very fascinating company, Henry Kissinger, Colin Powell, Condoleezza Rice. Did you discuss kind of the strategy with everyone there?
I did. And then those were really fruitful discussions for me. All of them were very gracious. It's kind of a club, of former national security advisors. It crosses over, between partisan lines. One of my best conversations was with Zbigniew Brzezinski just before he passed away. I didn't even know he was ill. We were scheduled, I think, for a half an hour call, and we talked for like an hour and a half, and he gave a lot of really good advice about personalities and relationships and the nature of the relationship with the president in particular. So I was really grateful for that. And I think that, I'm a historian, right? So, of course, I was just inclined to learn from the history of those who've gone before me. I think that a lot of ways history is an exercise in humility, because what you're saying is, I don't have all the answers, and so you learn from the experiences of others. And I think in this kind of a job, I felt pretty well prepared for it by the range of experiences I had in the Army, and in particular, the opportunity the Army gave me to read, think, research, and write about how and why Vietnam became an American war, which became a book called Dereliction of Duty. And so I'd written about the dysfunction of national security decision-making and policy-making under the Lyndon Johnson administration. And so at least I knew the mistakes I wanted to avoid, so I could make new mistakes, as someone who walked into McGeorge Bundy's office and had this kind of surreal feeling, okay, now, smarty pants, from a history perspective, you're now in charge of the decision-making and policy-making process you criticized from the perspective of a historian.
It's interesting you bring up Dereliction of Duty. That was published in 1997, I believe, and you were analyzing and exposing kind of the military strategic roles in the LBJ administration. And you say something which stands out to me. History doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes.
Yes.
And are we rhyming right now?
I think we are rhyming. I think that all the issues that are in the book are still live issues, right? Vladimir Putin's aggression, right? Still center, right? China's ambitions and various forms of aggression as we see them become, really very aggressive in the South China Sea vis-a-vis the Philippines, which is a treaty ally of the United States, just violating Japan's airspace last week. The threat from Iran and the degree to which Iran is continuing to support terrorist organizations and militias and form proxy armies to keep the Arab world perpetually weak and enmeshed in conflict, and to establish this ring of fire through its proxies around Israel, and in an effort to push the United States out of the region as the first step, really, of destroying Israel and killing all the Jews. It's what Iran wants to do. And it's a threat that's about to get more dangerous as they race toward a threshold nuclear capability. So I could go on, but all the issues that we grappled with in that very consequential year from 2017 to 2018 are still quite at the forefront of geopolitics and international threats and opportunities today.
You're a leader, you're a combat veteran, you're a patriot. Is Donald Trump a patriot?
Raj, I would say yes. I believe that he wants what's best for the country. His brand of patriotism is different from others. It's more maybe overstated. He's not a big hugger of people, but he is known occasionally to hug a flag. If anybody's noticed that, on stage. But I believe in my time serving him that he wanted what was best for the country. Now he also predominantly wants what's best for Donald Trump, right? So I write in the book, one of the elements of the analysis is he is most effective when he views his personal interests as aligned, right, with what are the most important policy initiatives to advance and protect American interests, to strengthen American security and promote American prosperity and influence in the world. So there are occasions when those are aligned, and he put into place, for example, I think, some of the most significant shifts in U.S. foreign policy since the end of the Cold War. Many of these were long overdue, and I'm thinking in particular the shift from competition to competition with China, away from cooperation and engagement, and finally kind of jettisoning the unrealistic hope that China, having been welcomed into the international order, would play by the rules, and as China prospered, that Chinese Communist Party leadership would liberalize its economy and its form of governance. We knew by 2017 that wasn't going to be the case, and we needed a fundamentally different policy. Where I think his kind of personality and character, his disruptive nature, became maybe too disruptive and led to the case where he disrupted his own policies, was in the area of the South Asia strategy. I think a decision that he made that was long overdue again, and the best decision available in August of 2017, on Afghanistan, Pakistan, the approach to India and all of South Asia, in which he administered some important correctives to previous policies, taking the timeline off of our commitment, recognizing that we were there to enable the Afghans to fight their fight on a modern day frontier between barbarism and civilization. He had looked over the precipice of what a precipitous withdrawal would entail and lead to in Afghanistan, and he backed away from that. But in subsequent months, after I left the job, a lot of people were in his ear, and he was prone to hearing, comments like, "This makes you look weak to your base," your base expects you to end the so-called endless wars and so forth. And so I write about how his character and personality lent itself to disruption, and I think all of us could probably agree there's a lot in Washington that needs to be disrupted. But of course, at times he can be so disruptive that he becomes kind of the antagonist in his own story.
Take us behind the scenes, just sitting with him, whether it's in the Oval Office, whether it's in the executive residence. Just is it a 5-minute briefing with him? Is it a 40-minute conversation? Is he watching Fox, CNN? What's happening here?
Well, it just depends, on what's happening that day and what the purpose of those interactions are. The National Security Advisor is the only person in the national security and foreign policy establishment who has the president as his or her only client. So to serve that president well, you have to be a conduit of information, analysis, communications from the president's closest advisors and from the president back to them. And so to understand what the president's thinking, to help the president know what those on the national security team would like him to know, you interact with the president multiple times a day. And I write about some of the early meetings in the Trump administration that I think were kind of dysfunctional. I describe one of the early presidential daily briefing meetings and intelligence briefing for the president as, an exercise in competitive sycophancy. And I decided, hey, the president is, he really is someone who likes to play to a crowd, right?
And this crowd is in the Oval Office
and it goes in the Oval Office. So I pared that meeting down, for example. And then what we did is we President Trump is kind of a conversational learner, right? He's not somebody who's going to sit down for a long briefing or PowerPoint slides or anything like that. And so what I found my job to do, I thought was important for me to do, is to provide him with the real experts who could talk with him based on their experiences. And he would really kind of like those kind of discussions. And it was those discussions that would help him evolve his understanding of some of the more complicated challenges we were facing. And then also, I think, make decisions that cut against maybe his predilections, and I tell a few stories about that. But then, of course, when there are really important decisions to be made, like, for example, when President Trump made the decision to respond to the mass murder of innocent civilians, including scores of children in Syria, using some of the most, the gruesome, heinous weapons on earth, sarin nerve gas, we had a formal National Security Council meeting and followed it with a subsequent National Security Council meeting. When it was time to take the consequential decision on what to do about the South Asia strategy and the war in Afghanistan in particular, we went off-site to Camp David, away from all distractions. But some of our best conversations were like in the back dining room, outside of the Oval Office, where the president liked to relax a little bit and get out of the formality of the Oval Office. And those less structured conversations was where I think, he made some important decisions as well. I tell the story in the book of in early December of 2017, kind of doing a year in review with the president. Here are the shifts in policy you've put into place. Here's where we are on implementation of these policies. And I brought up the issue of whether or not to provide and sell defensive capabilities, Javelin missiles in particular, to Ukraine. And in this kind of informal conversation, I had brought a chart with me to ask him to make that decision, because he had heard from all of his cabinet already, and everybody was in agreement that we should provide defensive capabilities to the Ukrainians. I laid out a chart that showed on the bottom of the timeline really events that communicated a sense of weakness or the perception of weakness to Vladimir Putin. And then immediately after that, on the top of that timeline, an act of Russian aggression, whether it was the denial of service attacks against Estonia in 2007, the invasion of Georgia in 2008, the initial invasion of Ukraine in 2014, which I think came as a result of the unenforced red line in Syria under the Obama administration. And so the point that I was trying to make to him in that informal discussion was, hey, Mr. President, everybody wants to allay Putin's security concerns under the belief that they can get to some kind of an entente with Vladimir Putin. But that's not what provokes Putin, is his security concerns. What provokes Putin is the perception of weakness. And you can maybe prevent a war by providing these capabilities to Ukraine. He said, okay, General. I brought him the decision memo with 3 options. A, no javelins. B, we provide all of them, which I knew he would never for free, to foreign military assistance. And C, which appealed to him more, which is to sell some and to provide some. So those, that kind of informal discussion was often, quite useful.
Did it offend you? It seems like you actually adapted your teaching style. At that point, you were a teacher in many ways to him, to the president, that he didn't want a big booklet of stats and analysis, but really kind of more note cards and bullet points.
Yeah, that's right. And he also wanted to get to the essence of the issue. And, I'll tell you, I wrote an essay or adapted an essay for The Atlantic recently, which, some people, if you really detest Donald Trump, which a lot of people do, it probably was off-putting, but I was like, hey, he's not wrong all the time. Some of his instincts are right, especially in the areas of, burden sharing for allies, reciprocity in trade relationships. I write a degree, and I've mentioned this, about of how he can be inconsistent on some issues, but there are some things that he's really very consistent on that I think are fundamentally sound. And so, he would always ask, and I write about this a little bit in the book, he always would ask implicitly 3 or 4 questions. And I sent these to our team, and said, hey, whenever you craft materials for the president, try to do them in such a way that they address these questions that kind of are always on his mind, right?
Smart.
Right, which is like, he would always want to know, so what? Why do we care about this, right? And this, I think, this channels a lot of frustrations of a lot of Americans who think, hey, we've got a lot of problems here at home. Like, what are, why are we so involved overseas? There's a real skepticism about sustained even diplomatic engagement, let alone military engagement abroad. So it's important to explain to the president, but also for the president to explain to the American people, so what? Why do we care? What are our vital interests that are at stake? Then he would also ask, why do we have to do it? Right? Again, back to burden sharing. Can't somebody else do that? And so you have to answer the question, what the United States brings that's unique, but of course, how we can partner with others and build a team of strategic partners or some of our treaty allies to share the burden and to do a lot of the heavy work associated with, fighting jihadist terrorist organizations and, fill in the blank spot, in Syria or in the campaign against ISIS, for example. And then finally he said, how much does it cost, right? He would ask, how much does it cost? And can you drive the cost down of doing it? So these
are all valid questions.
These are all valid questions, right? Valid questions. And it was my job. It's not my job to force a briefing. It wouldn't work with them anyway, to force a comprehensive briefing. It was my job to adapt to the way the president receives information. And I knew as a historian that presidents receive information in different ways. They structure their advisory relationships in radically different ways. And there are advantages and disadvantages to both. I mean, one of the greatest scholars of presidential character and presidential leadership I got to know over the years, the late Alexander George, if anybody knew him at Stanford. He was a fantastic human being, but his work is really sound, as is the Princeton scholar Fred Greenstein on decision making. So I'd written quite a bit about this and done a lot of the research around it as I was studying history for my degree at the University of North Carolina and to inform my writing of Dereliction of Duty. And so, I came in with the benefit of that and knowing, hey, I'm not going to get Donald Trump to change to my preferred method of communication. It's my job to adapt to how he receives information.
How'd you get fired?
Hey, the good old-fashioned way, a phone call. No, not by tweet. The tweet followed. But so he and I had some really direct conversations, about leaving. And, I think what brought it about is, I did get kind of used up with him. And I was at peace with that. I remembered when I had written about how why Vietnam became an American war, I wrote about how a lot of Lyndon Johnson's advisors, and one of them actually said this in an oral history interview, hey, to maintain my influence with the president, I found that I just had to tell the president what the president wanted to hear. And of course, that begs the question, okay, what the heck good is your influence anyway, if that's what you're doing? So I recognized that for me to tell Donald Trump or any president what he wanted to hear, that would be a disservice to the president. But in doing so, I think it did get me used up. I really talk about the president's personality and how he can change his mind. But after he does, he kind of wants to blame somebody for it, for having to change his mind, And hey, that was one of the services I provided, to President Trump is to be like the guy to receive the blame. So I was getting used up in that connection, and then of course there were all those who were attacking the trust between us and so forth. And I described the events that led up to the final conversation I had with the Chief of Staff, John Kelly. One morning after a frustrating conversation for both of us, President Trump and I just said, "Hey, just give me a date." And
date meaning your exit.
Date for my exit, because the president and I had talked about it. And I told the president, he'd always say to me, "Who do you think would be a good replacement for you?" And I would give him some names, and he'd often say, "What do you think about John? What do you think about John?" He meant John Bolton. And I said, "Hey, if you trust him, if you value his judgment, he's the right guy for you."
So let me get this straight. He's asking you about who should replace you.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
Was that awkward?
No, it wasn't. So here,
Is he eating a cheeseburger doing this? What's happening here?
No, in fact, initially he didn't want to have the conversation because I knew this conversation was happening because there's all these games that happen in the West Wing of the White House, and I think there were members of the president's cabinet and who wanted me out again because they saw me as giving him options, and they thought they needed to control Trump, and the way to control him was to kind of meet information to him, to limit what he got. I don't think that works with Donald Trump, first of all, right? Because he's reflexively contrary. And if you go to him and say, hey, everybody agrees, this is exactly what you should do, I mean, he's likely just to do the opposite, right? Just to spite everybody. So it's in the presentation and me fighting for multiple options that strained my relationship with other key members of the cabinet. So they were looking to replace me with somebody, I think somebody who would be have the same kind of philosophy. Well, they didn't get that. They got John Bolton, and so I mean, I'm tempted to say poetic justice, but anyway, and
no one's watching.
No, but I knew they were going to be oil and water. I mean, I respect Ambassador Bolton. He's, I was probably, kind of aligned with him on everything, from a foreign policy perspective, but we're much different from a style perspective, and I kind of suspected it wouldn't work out. But again, I guess the main point is, to get to your question, is I felt like the job I was in, was much bigger than me, any individual. It was my duty to the president and the country to ease a good transition. So I told the president, hey, listen, I'll stay on, with whoever you select, and I did that. And the last chapter is entitled "The Last 385 Yards," alluding to the end of a marathon. And it's the period of time after which I was fired by the president in a very cordial phone call. By the way, and the time when John Bolton took over, and we did actually get a lot done in that period of time. You might recall that was in the spring of 2018, and the attempted assassination of Sergei Skripal and his daughter using a banned nerve agent had occurred in Salisbury, England. And we were putting together the response for that, and the president chose a very strong response, which resulted in part in the closing of the consulate in Seattle, the expulsion of scores of undeclared Russian intelligence agents. And remember, you probably here in San Francisco, you probably remember the closure of the San Francisco Russian consulate in the summer of 2017, and also the expulsion of a lot of undeclared intelligence agents. So a lot of the story in the book is how President Trump was able to make these tough decisions, even though he still had this idea of having a big deal, with Putin, and he disliked imposing these costs on Putin, I think, because he thought it would make it more difficult for them to come to that entente, which was never going to happen anyway, in my view. So that story is about the time after I got fired, and I think it was still a period where we got quite a bit accomplished. And then it had a smooth handoff with Ambassador Bolton.
You get fired, then the phone call with the president, then the phone call to your wife, and how'd that go?
Yeah, it was good. So,
was she relieved?
Yeah. So what my wife, Katie, was working at the Catholic Diocese of Richmond, and so that was a kind of a long drive. She would go down there twice a week, and was driving back when I called her, and she started to cry because I think of just relief of hey, now we know what's happening. It wasn't really sadness, but also it was also kind of a big life change for us beyond just the kind of the maelstrom of being National Security Advisor. I served in the Army, as you mentioned, 34 years, and I write about that last day, driving away from the White House, feeling this tugging feeling, because I was leaving behind members of our team that I felt like I was leaving halfway through a mission, but also this tugging feeling at knowing it was my last assignment in our Army, I felt extremely privileged to serve in our Army and found service in our Army extraordinarily rewarding, being part of teams that really take on the quality of a family, in which the man or woman next to you is willing to give everything, including their own lives for you. That's very difficult to replicate, I think, in other professions. And so, it was an emotional time, but emotional in a mixture of emotions. I mean, mainly, I think, and maybe the dominant emotion was gratitude. Gratitude for the opportunity to have served. And secondly, maybe a little bit of disappointment that we could not have gotten more done. Disappointment that I couldn't have forged maybe a more harmonious relationship with some of the members of the cabinet who I had frictions with. And then, a disappointment at leaving behind a job that is consequential, where you feel like you really can make a difference. So, it was an emotional period of time, but again, the dominant emotion was gratitude at having had the opportunity to serve in that position.
I believe you said, don't write anything bad about me. president.
Yeah, it was.
So
it was
he knew
funny, yeah.
where this was going, and you still have a good relationship with him.
No, I think so. I think so. And I'll tell you the book, and I think this is in the copy for the book. It's the good, the bad, and the ugly. I mean, I think what's striking about I think the way most people view Donald Trump these days is because of how polarized we are and how polarizing he can be. He can say some pretty outlandish things and offensive things. But what I've found is, as I've was doing the research and thinking about this, is that oftentimes the reaction to whatever Donald Trump says can be just as bad or as worse as whatever he did. And so it is this centripetal forces that are spinning so far from each other, and I think has many people in one camp or the other. Like Donald Trump can do nothing that's good for the country and has done nothing, or he does everything. Everything he does is brilliant. So I think this book is not that. In fact, I was kind of my conversations with my editor, I thought, well, hey, maybe everybody's just going to hate this book, because it's not going to meet the expectations. As you mentioned, and I appreciate you saying this, it's not a hagiography, and it's not. I don't have an axe to grind either. It's just from my perspective, and I write in the note to readers up front that I've been a consumer of a lot of these books as a historian. And I always approach these books with a combination of skepticism and vigilance, and I hope readers will do the same as they look at my perspective of that year.
Could you please speak to how you see U.S.-India relationships going forward under either of the two presidential candidates? So if President Trump gets reelected or Kamala Harris gets elected.
Yeah, this is an area that I've remained engaged in because I believe the relationship has tremendous potential. And I write in the book about how we worked hard to reinvigorate the Quad format, which is the U.S., India, Australia, and Japan, and how we strengthened the relationship between the U.S. and India. A course of improved relations that I credit George W. Bush and Condoleezza Rice in particular for putting us on after the nuclear agreement. And multiple administrations, Republicans, Democrats now have built on that relationship. The reason why I think it's the relationship is just because of how vast India's capacity is in terms of its human capital potential, but also because with its population and its potential, the way India goes is kind of the way the world's going to go. And if India can succeed in the areas of human security, health security, energy security, and water security and food security, the world will succeed because the solutions that India comes up with the cooperation with us and other like-minded countries, will be applicable to the rest of the world. And so I think it is maybe the most consequential relationship going into the next century, but it has its limits. And I tell the story in the book about how we worked to align our efforts, and I worked with two of the people who are still on the job in India, Minister Jaishankar and Ajit Doval, both of whom became very good friends. I write at the end about a long walk I took with Ajit Doval after dinner at my house, reflecting back on our work together. And he had read the leaks, because this is how they get ready to get rid of you in Washington, is they leak that you're leaving, So that had already happened. And so Ajit was saying, like, hey, how much longer are you going to be around and everything. So it was the night before President Trump fired me. And so, but we're reflecting on our relationship, the degree to which we had alignment, especially around the threat from the Chinese Communist Party and its increasing, really, economic aggression, and then, of course, as India would learn soon, the physical aggression, as we saw PLA soldiers bludgeoning Indian soldiers to death on the Himalayan frontier. So there was a very strong alignment there, and alignment vis-a-vis Pakistan. I mean, India is a country, we have to remember, is surrounded by two hostile nuclear-armed states, and so. But I think what we've seen in recent months, years, since the invasion of Ukraine, is the limits to which we can move toward maybe a real alliance, between us, and that has a lot to do with India's desire to hedge, right? And Minister Jaishankar wrote a book, The Indian Way, in which he was very candid about this, and that that India is not going to be completely aligned with the United States. This is partly generational, I think, to a degree. And a legacy of the non-aligned movement and the long relationship with the Soviet Union and now Russia. But I think the reluctance we've seen in deepening our relationship on the side of India has to do with almost this schizophrenic nature of Indian leaders, where they're afraid both of abandonment and entrapment, right? and I think that after the disastrous and really humiliating withdrawal from Afghanistan in August of 2021, I think Indian leaders looked up behind their back, like, who's got our back? The United States is gone. They're out of Central Asia, South Asia. They just left Afghanistan to a terrorist organization. I've got a hostile China and Pakistan. Who do I hedge with, right? Russia is the only one who can maybe moderate the behaviors of states who are hostile to India. So that's a limit in terms of how far we can go with our alliances, that hedging behavior. And then I think also, the Hindu nationalist policies of the BJP are a cause for concern among many senior Americans these days, and the hope that that doesn't create internal violence, maybe even inside of India, that could really derail a lot of the progress India's making in the area of economic growth and so forth. But hey, that's a long answer to your question. I write about it considerably in the book. I also write about India in the book Battlegrounds, which is more of a survey of the international challenges and opportunities we face. But I'm a big believer in the relationship. I think that we have to not push too hard or expect too much from India, and let it happen naturally. It being a greater alignment and greater alignment of efforts to advance our mutual interests.
Your perspective and your knowledge is fascinating, and we really appreciate it. I'm going to ask you this for both candidates here. Your concerns about this election if Donald Trump wins. And again, I'm going to ask you about the other candidate as well.
Yeah, okay, so my concerns, I think, with Donald Trump get to be somewhat, just to sum up in one word, would be inconsistency, right? And in the book, I write about the dissonance that Donald Trump carries with him, how he holds opposing views in his head, and how I often tried, along with others, to help him reconcile those opposed views in a way that allowed him, again, to determine his own agenda and to put in place his own foreign policy and national security strategy. So to give you just an example, he believes in burden sharing, and the strength of alliances, right? Because if your allies share the burden and invest more in their defense, it's going to be stronger. That's good. But then when he crosses over to a negotiating tactic, right, where he thinks, well, if you don't pay your 2%, which means invest the equivalent of 2% of your GDP into defense, we're not going to defend you, or Russia can have their way. When he says things like that, I think that's irresponsible and actually weakens the alliance, which again cuts against what he really wants to achieve, which is to strengthen the alliance. Another example would be that he believes in peace through strength in a kind of a Reagan-esque way. I mean, I think he really does understand that it's a heck of a lot cheaper to deter a war than to have to fight one. And your ability to deter comes with really hard power, your ability to demonstrate to a potential enemy that enemy cannot accomplish their objectives through the use of force. But he's skeptical about U.S. joint force capabilities and positioned abroad. For example, in places like South Korea or Europe or Japan, you name it, where we are abroad. But of course, it's the presence of those forces who can operate as part of an alliance that communicate to your potential enemies that they can accomplish their objectives. And I write about our trip to Honolulu and how I hoped that as we reflected back on the attacks on not only on Pearl Harbor, but the Japanese, Imperial Japan's centripetal offensive that pushed us out of the inner island chain in the Pacific, that he would recognize from a historical perspective that it's a heck of a lot harder to fight to regain admission to a theater than to already be there, right? And preferably deter the conflict from happening at all. So, again, these are just examples, I guess, of the thing to be concerned about, I think, with another President Trump Part 2, would be some of those inconsistencies and that dissonance.
What concerns you if Kamala Harris becomes president?
Well, I would be concerned if there were a continuation of some of the Biden policies. In some areas, the Biden administration has, I think, been strong, and there have been strong elements of continuity, with what I would regard as Trump's better decisions and more important decisions. especially on China and countering Chinese economic aggression and deterring other various forms of China's aggression, including cyber espionage and so forth, as well as physical aggression, in the South China Sea and everything. Strengthening some of the alliances associated with that. I mean, I think the AUKUS agreement is good, and it's additive to alliances and purpose-built. The degree to which our relationship is strengthened, even much stronger with South Korea based on the Yoon government versus the Moon government, and then also with Japan, continue deepening. I mean, I could go on. A lot of positive things. The negative aspects of the Biden administration are those in which they try to reverse Trump's policies in a reflexive way. And I think this is what we have to break the cycle of. We can no longer afford for a new president to come in and define his or her foreign policy mainly as in opposition to the predecessor, right? Instead, we should look at what are the real value of these policies. And I'm thinking, of course, in the Biden administration as the reversal of the policy toward Iran. I think that was a terrible mistake to try to conciliate Iran, to try to resurrect the Iran nuclear deal, the JCPOA. It reminded me of the movie, Weekend at Bernie's, when they're trying to the deal's dead. Stop trying to act like Bernie's alive, but in doing this, they essentially relaxed sanctions enforcement, the result of which was the transfer of about $100 billion into Iran's coffers that largely went to the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps, which then, of course, were transferred to Iran's proxy army in Syria, the Hashd-e-Shaabi militias in Iraq, the Houthis in Yemen, Hezbollah, Hamas, and Palestinian Islamic Jihad. And so I believe that policy has been destructive to our interests, destructive to the interests of the Gulf states, and destructive to Israel's interests and security. So I think a reversal of that would be really important. A continuation of the Biden approach to Iran and to the Middle East, I think, would be a big mistake. I think in many ways, the Biden administration forfeited the momentum that was behind the Abraham Accords during the Trump administration. The other area, just to talk about specific policies, would be in defense, and in energy security and in supply chain security. I think the big lessons of the massive reinvasion of Ukraine have not been internalized by the Biden administration. And if Vice President Harris is elected, I hope that she would affect a change in the course here. The Biden administration's defense budget is a real reduction when adjusted for inflation. And we're coping with a bow wave of deferred military modernization, and we have some real capacity issues on our armed forces. Part of our recruiting effort, I think, shortfalls, has to do with the degree to which the Pentagon is distracted by missions that are not core to the mission of the Department of Defense, and maybe also efforts, I think, to push certain agendas within the military that are destructive to combat effectiveness. I think a focus on the mission is needed in the Department of Defense, and I think we need to increase the resources available for our defense to deter conflict, address the bow wave of deferred modernization. That includes, our fielded forces, but it's also our defense industrial base, which has atrophied considerably. And many of our critical supply chains, even for national defense, have become reliant on single points of failure that are controlled by the Chinese Communist Party. And so what we need an approach to economic statecraft that really strengthens our defense industrial base, that hardens and protects our national security innovation base from cyber and other forms of espionage by our adversaries. And we need investments in making our supply chains, which have become optimized for efficiency, much more resilient than they are. And then finally, in the area of energy security, I think this has been a real foot shot for the Biden administration. A real missed opportunity. Because in constraining, for example, U.S. production and transit export of natural gas, we have actually delayed the transition off of the highest carbon-emitting sources of energy, coal in particular. We have empowered our adversaries. The Biden administration canceled the Canadian pipeline and then green-lighted Nord Stream 2. How does that make sense? And so we have an opportunity, to lift the moratorium that the Biden administration put on new permitting for LNG export facilities, to help solve the world's energy security problem, maybe even drive the cost of natural gas down for Americans. Could even maybe tax that a little bit, pay down our debt, fund the green transition that way. I mean, we have a lot of gifts, and this could also, of course, reduce carbon emissions in my view, because we produce that LNG much cleaner than Russia does, or Venezuela for that matter, or Iran for that matter. So anyway, I think that others will meet that supply of natural gas if we don't. And then, of course, we want to continue to innovate in sources of green energy, EM squared fission, for example, and then solar and wind, which are taking off. We also need, by the way, massive investment in our electrical grid. Energy demand is going way up for a number of reasons. If we do need to bring a lot of manufacturing back, and we want to apply some advanced manufacturing techniques to that, to reinvigorate an industrial base, and artificial intelligence, the computing power associated with artificial intelligence, is driving energy demand up in a way that's going to really strain our electrical grid. And because we're so decentralized in the United States, it's going to take a massive effort by the federal government to integrate the efforts of state and local governments and the private sector to address what I think is a coming energy crisis if we don't begin those investments now.
With this election coming up, a few months from now, Kamala Harris has said that she would reach across the aisle in her cabinet or her inner circle there, bring in a Republican. If she reached out to you and said, would you want to come back and be serious? Was that something you would consider? Because you do feel a duty and an honor to serve the country.
Well, I would serve in any administration where I think I could make a difference and help the elected president and help put into place sensible policies and strategies that advance American security, American prosperity, and our influence at the world. And what I believe in, we didn't really address this very much, is I think an extremely dangerous time for our country and the world. So, I mean, I do feel like it's my duty to serve if I can make a difference. But the question would be, would I be able to make a difference? I mean, I think that both parties have become so kind of partisan. How does it work to be, the person who comes in from, I think I'm an independent. I think I write about this in the book. I didn't vote the whole time I was an officer in the Army, and that means my whole life until after I retired, because I took the oath of service on the plane at West Point at the age of 17. And one of my heroes was George Marshall. And George Marshall had studiously never voted because he thought it was very important to keep that bold line in place between the military and partisan politics. So I'm not a political person. I'm not really aligned with either party. I just feel like it would be my duty to serve, any next president, like I did, the previous six presidents. I served briefly under President Biden until he fired me also, which just bolstered my bipartisan credentials. Thank you. No, I was on the board of visitors at West Point, and was fired by President Biden too.
So. All right, we've got a bunch of questions. We're going to whip through these in our final 10 minutes here from the audience. What can we do as individuals to promote constructive dialogue and discourse to work towards creating respectful, constructive solutions to meet the challenges we face?
Well, what a great question. I think we can all do it. Just do what we're doing now. Just have a conversation about kind of the challenges we're facing. Take a kind of a clear-eyed appraisal, of what we've learned from recent history and how we can apply it to policies that make sense to help secure a better future for generations to come. And I don't think we can wait for the political class. I don't know what anybody thinks about that. I mean, I think they're not going to do it, maybe. I mean, so I think it's in clubs like this, that bring people together for these kind of discussions where we can all make a difference. I mean, it's in the classroom where I'm privileged to teach at Stanford. Hopefully we model in our class, what it means to have a respectful conversation. I think we all need a huge dose of empathy, and I write in the book Battlegrounds about strategic empathy, a term I borrowed from my dear friend Zachary Shore, who's a fantastic historian. He's written great books One of them is sense of the enemy, in which he coins this term strategic empathy. And essentially what he's arguing for is trying to view any of the complex challenges or opportunities we're facing internationally from the perspective of the other, especially rivals, adversaries, and especially enemies, and to try to understand better, the emotions, the aspirations, and in that case, the ideologies sometimes that drive and constrain others. I think we can start with facts. A lot of times, the most vitriolic conversations are kind of fact-free. I don't know if you notice that, and the people who know this seems to be the least about a topic are those who are most adamant about their position. So I just think that creating the right formats, for long format conversations and convening people or to have these kind of respectful discussions is important. And I think just we have to stop going ad hominem right away. It seems that that's what everybody wants to do, is to try to knock down the other person because they disagree with that person. And I think that also transcending kind of this kind of toxic interaction between new forms of bigotry, I would call it, various forms of identity politics with old forms of racism and sexism that I think, again, just create these centripetal forces. And finally, I think we should be more confident, We should be more confident in America and in who we are as a people and our common identity as Americans. And I do believe that we are seeing to some extent the result of what you might call kind of the curriculum of self-loathing in our universities that has been, I think, affected by various postmodernist, post-colonial, critical theories that have become a dominant voice in the humanities. Now, these approaches to history, they're kind of neo-Marxist views of history and teach people that really impersonal forces drive the course of events. You don't really have any agency. The only way that you can affect change is through revolution and tearing everything down. I just don't think that's very good for our psyche, But that's what has become dominant. And I think that we should encourage our young people in particular to question these sorts of orthodoxies, look at the historical record, and also recognize, the great gifts of this country, while also recognizing that there's more work to be done, right? And to kind of agree with our founders and John Adams in particular, who said that our republic will require constant nurturing. I think what our young people today experience when they get kind of filled with this orthodoxy is it sadly robs them of agency, right? And when you rob people of agency, you leave them with a toxic combination of anger and resignation, right? So, I'm inspired by a Clinton quotation, and by Clinton, of course, I mean George Clinton of Parliament Funkadelic. And what he said in the America Eats Its Young album in 1972, which was a pretty bleak period of time in the 70s, right? I mean, we had a lost war in Vietnam, we had the resignation of a president, we had stagflation, we had multiple energy crises, we had a hostage crisis in Iran. I mean, right? So he said, if you don't like the effect, don't produce the cause. And the lyrics are something like this, ain't you deep in your semi-first class seat? You protest this and protest that and eat yourself fat. But this is the important line. Situation is just that. It has no power over you. So I think that we should recognize that we do have a say in how we're governed in this country, and we should be proud about that and proud about, the gifts of freedom of expression, of rule of law. I think my service in places where those freedoms don't exist have maybe heightened my appreciation, and gratitude for the country we live in.
Well said.
Yeah.
Few more minutes, so let's whip through some questions here. And this is an hour-long response, perhaps, but can you do it in about 30 seconds? What do we do about Ukraine? What is the best end game?
I think provide Ukraine with everything that they need to win. And to win means Ukraine is able to do two things. So first of all, establish an objective. The objective would be a free and independent Ukraine that can defend itself and prevent further aggression against it. And that is back on the path to economic recovery. To do that, they need a range of military capabilities and sufficient capacity to get that job done. First, a range of capabilities to stop the onslaught against their population, against their infrastructure. And the second would be to restore an offensive capability to regain as much of the territory as they can and to communicate clearly by those battlefield results that Vladimir Putin has no option but to negotiate a settlement that is favorable to the Ukrainians. I think this idea that you can just freeze or have like a ceasefire is nonsensical. Wars don't end that way. You know, I think we have this kind of nostalgic view of the Balkans and the Dayton Accords, and we forget that it was actually the Croatian offensive against the Serbs that set conditions for the Dayton Accords in the 90s. So the political outcome in Ukraine will reflect what the Ukrainians are able to achieve militarily, and I think we should stop meting out this assistance and provide them with the full range of capabilities, but in sufficient capacity. I mean, really, 31 tanks? I mean, you know, if we were Ecuador, I could see that we give them 31 tanks. But I mean, I think we should, and of course, I'm an armor guy, so I think in terms of tanks, you know, try to think of a problem you can't solve with a tank, right? No, but there, of course, there are a whole range of other capabilities. You know, think of anybody see Kelly's Heroes? You know, that Donald Sutherland says, you know, a tank will give you a nice edge, is what he says.
What was the most memorable part of your job? Anything you miss?
I miss the people. I'll tell you, I hope it comes through in the book, Raj. I mean, I probably laughed more in that year than I did, you know, any recent year.
Laughed, then cried?
Yeah, but it was, I mean, so it was a bit of it was gallows humor, but also we really did have a sense of that we're fortunate to be together. And I worked with some fantastic people. I mean, what I hope that the book is in large measure about you know, encountering a number of obstacles, you know, some of them interpersonal and dealing with personalities and characters and relationships and so forth. What's going on in our society, another obstacle, a big obstacle are like the adversaries we're facing internationally, but really how we work together to overcome those obstacles and the kind of the kind of collaboration we were able to foster within the NSC staff, really across the departments and agencies of the government, and with like-minded partners internationally. You know, we had this, you know, kind of club of national security advisors from like-minded countries, and it was a real privilege to do that. So, yeah, so I guess, you know, we really did. In fact, you know, Vice President Pence, I had the opportunity to actually talk with him this past week. It was kind of the call about the book, and he said to me, he said, you know, every time I was walking down the hall, I would hear laughter coming out of the National Security Advisor's office, and because I think we were all just felt fortunate to be able to work together and to be able to work on such important tasks and have such an important mission for the country.
How do you order food at the White House? You just pick up the phone? And...
You know, I'll tell you, I didn't figure it out at first, and I was working like crazy hours because you know, I got hired on a Monday, flew back with the president that day on Air Force One. They had 2 Osprey aircraft to fly me back to Tidewater, Virginia, where I packed a bag, flew back, and started Tuesday afternoon. So for those first few days, you can imagine, I try to avoid the word chaos because it's so prevalent and everything about the Trump administration. But yeah, it was kind of chaotic, you know, because my predecessor had left, unexpectedly. There was still kind of the transition between administrations going on, new people coming in, and it was just. So it was kind of chaotic. And I remember those first few days, oftentimes I would say, wow, geez, I wonder what I should have for lunch. And I look at the clock and it's like 5:30 p.m., you know? So fortunately, Colin Powell, who was a fantastic person, you know, he invited me to his house for lunch. I ate everything in sight. I think he was just astonished, you know? And he said, man, I need to have you over more often. You're not. But I discovered, you know, after the first couple of weeks on the job, there's the White House mess. There's a Navy mess right there. You can just order up a sandwich, you know, or you can go down and take a break and be civilized and have a lunchtime conversation with somebody. So, which I try to do. So it's a fantastic little facility there where you can host people for lunch and you know, have less formal discussions with colleagues so I did eventually figure that out.
Okay, as we wrap it up, thank you for some wonderful questions. As we wrap it up, I know you're a big fan of music. You like the Grateful Dead. I saw you at a Duran Duran concert. What's the top 3 playlist songs? What bands?
Oh my gosh, you know. Hey, so I'll tell you, I mean, that Kara keeps me current with everything, but you know, I mean, back in the day, I mean, I had every Led Zeppelin album for sure, you know, and would listen to, you know, the heaviest and most the most intense tunes before every rugby match. Maybe mixing in some James Thorogood and stuff like that as well, and some Nazareth. so like some heavy metal, would get me going for sports. But then I really enjoy like female vocalists and vocalists like Natalie Merchant, Sheryl Crow, and that whole genre. But my new thing is to try to learn more about jazz, because I got to meet some jazz musicians, and I'm really starting to understand the genre better. I appreciate it, music. I have no musical talent at all, as Freddie will tell you, who is a very talented musician here. But the band that I would want to highlight to all of you is called the Wobbly World Band. Okay. Ooh. And this is Freddie Clark from Menlo Park. This is his band that he put together. And what I love about this band is it's fantastic music, first of all. But what they have done is blended together musical genres from all over the world. The musicians in the band are mostly naturalized citizens from all over the world. So the band is a metaphor for how we can transcend, the violence and vitriol in this world and celebrate our common humanity. And I believe that music helps you do that more than any other art form, because it's common across all cultures. We can all appreciate it. And then also, I think it helps us restore confidence in our common identity as Americans. These are all extraordinarily patriotic, talented musicians who have different perspectives on things, what's going on in the world. But again, it's a celebration of art and how art can transcend difference. But it's a celebration of, I think, the nature of our country and the greatest strengths of our country. They often play at the Guild Theater, and I think, Freddie, are you playing this at the Stanford Park Hotel on Friday? Okay, so check them out. And I get to introduce them sometimes, and it's kind of confounding to people. They're like, man, what is this bald, washed-up general doing? Introducing this band. But hey, I really believe that music can bring us together and transcend, a lot of the problems that we're facing today.
Beautiful thoughts. You are certainly bald, but you are not washed up. Our thanks to everyone here listening on YouTube, online, and everyone in this room. Our thanks, of course, to General H.R. McMaster, the former National Security Advisor and author of At War with Ourselves, My Tour of Duty in the Trump White House. And we want to thank the Travers Family Foundation for supporting today's program. Thank you all very much. Enjoy your day. And thanks to the Commonwealth Club here in San Francisco.
Thanks, Raj. Thanks to all of you. Thank you.